You'll remember that we've put our base together, so we're now going to put the base onto the stand and then we can start fully assembling the machine. Looking at the rubber adjustment screw and keeping that in relation to the half moon hole in the base, we bring the bottom of the machine around, then we do the wing nuts up at the bottom of the base. Looking down through the base of the machine, just ensure that the dial adjusting knob isn't jammed against the side, either side of the machine. So it just makes it a little bit easier to manipulate when you're using, and screw the wing nuts up. Everything's hunky-dory. And we can now go on to the next step of putting our gear ring and camshell on. We're now going to place the gear ring on, and approximately in that position in relation to the rubber post, with your handle fully down, pretty well vertical. And yeah, there is a little bit of trial and error with this, so that's round about the position. We then need to put the camshell on, so we'll just bring that round a bit so that we don't bang onto there. And this is very important. The camshell stoppers here must be in between the two stoppers on the gear ring. So there's your two stoppers on the gear ring. So there's no point putting your camshell on back to front because your machine just will not work. So that's your camshell, and a good test is once you've done this, if you can turn round and then go in reverse without banging into any of the cams or the knobs or your yarn guide, then you're probably pretty well in the right position. I'm sure by now most of you will have realised that there were two parts missing from the original setup on the table when all the parts were laid out. I wonder if you can guess what they are. They are the stitch cams. They are very, very important, and there is a left stitch cam and there's a right stitch cam. Now, the reason that I'm making a big deal out of these is the stitch cams on the New Zealand auto knitter are the opposite way to stitch cams on an American or a Canadian auto knitter, or for that fact the English beehives, any of those machines. The pointed part, or I suppose if you looked at it as though it was a triangle, the apex of the triangle must face downwards into the bottom of the camshell. So the left hand stitch cam, we'll do the right hand one first, goes into the camshell with the triangle facing downwards. If you, which a lot of people have done, put them on the opposite way, your machine will immediately jam and you'll be into all sorts of trouble. We now do the same with the right hand one. Once again, it will only go that way. Just remember, these camshells will go in the opposite way, so they will go in the wrong way, but the machine will jam. Now is a good time to get your adjuster nut for your rubber guide, and just make sure that that rubber guide is up reasonably vertical. You have to get your cylinder. We're going to put the cylinder in the machine now. There's an indentation in the cylinder, and that is to go in behind the rubber stopper arm. So we place our cylinder in that way and drop it down in between those cams. Don't worry if the cams fall out, do it again and do it again and do it again, because it happens to me most of the time as well. We then line up, make sure that the cylinder is actually seated in and feeling like it's where it belongs. Underneath there are two lugs in the bottom of the camshell. Take the two screws, the two cylinder screws, and screw them just lightly into the hole in the bottom of the cylinder, and we'll tighten them up once we've got them both in. Once again, when tightening screws, you've got two screws at opposite ends. Don't tighten one down hard and then go to the other one, because you'll either bend something or you won't seat the cylinder in properly, and then you'll get trouble when you're knitting and jam ups. So just lightly tighten that screw up, then go to the other one and do the same, and then go back and do your final tighten on both of them. Everything's turning nicely. We're nearly ready to knit. Right, we've got our yarn mask that we already assembled earlier. drop the mast down into the hole into the base, face it forwards, and screw at the back of the base up so your yarn mast is nice and tight, and just ensuring that the one on top is tight as well without stabbing yourself. We're ready to put some needles in our machine. First thing we have to do before we put the needles in the machine and get ready to set up to knit is put our cylinder spring on. Now, the cylinder spring goes over the cylinder into the groove there, and that's the normal position it will be. When we're putting our needles in, we just pull our cylinder spring over the cylinder spring holder. And the way I always do this is just hook a needle under the cylinder spring, pull it out, just grab it in your fingers and slip it over there. Now, because we're setting up a 1-in-1 rib, I'm just going to put a needle in every second slot. This is a 72 slot cylinder, by the way, and we'll be using a 36 ribber. I'm going to knit with 2 strands of what we call in New Zealand 110 bar 2-tex. You would call it a very light 2-ply, and 2 strands of it will be equivalent to a 3-ply yarn. So not a bad yarn for this cylinder, maybe a little bit light, but for demonstration purposes it's pretty good. So I'm going to put, you'll notice that there are already hash marks on the cylinder, and you can't actually put hash marks on your cylinder until you've got all the needles in and you've set up the position for the uplift cams. So I'll show you how that happens very shortly, but we'll get every second needle in. And then we just turn it round, and you'll notice that that cylinder spring's still out, and it makes it very easy. Now there is another way of doing this, and that's putting the cylinder spring back in, and this is the way I do it. I just clip them down. It's a little bit faster, probably I'm a bit more used to it. Just push the butt down in behind the spring and around you go. So either or. Yarn guide needs now adjusting because we've come around there and the yarn guide isn't screwed up. So once again, our pretty pink screwdriver comes in very, very handy. It's a good colour pink. And I can't get it to grip, but we'll come around a little bit more, and we are going to do a bit more adjustment on this yarn guide once we get some yarn on there and get everything set up. But just cranking around a bit, and every second needle. So just remember, if you come around on the first lot and you don't have this yarn guide adjusted, the hooks will catch in the hole in the yarn guide, and of course everything will come to a halt. So there are a lot of things to remember, but once you get used to it, it's like riding a bike. Alright, we're now cranking around, we've got all our needles in. You can hear the machine sounds a little bit noisy, so just a little bit of oil around, especially on a new machine. Being aluminium, you need a reasonable amount of oil for a start. A little bit of oil down around that gearing where it's going to go backwards and forwards. But on the whole, you don't need too much oil, and by the time you've knitted about 10 pairs of socks, you will need only a very minute amount of oil, just a few drops. In the US there is oil available that's a soap-based one, and it can be obtained from Eric Wolf, who you all know, and you'll have Eric's email address at the end of this video. Right, we're now going to put our row counter on in preparation to start knitting, and I told you earlier about having that facing the right way, and that's the reason why. So we just get that started and screwing that up reasonably, not too tight at the moment, but making sure that the little grooves in the bottom of the counter dial go into the grooves on the ferrule or the round disc that's attached. They are what are going to turn the counter around. And the other thing we can now do is tighten up the nut behind And I don't really need to show you this, but we do need to get a spanner and we need to tighten up the nut behind the crank, and that keeps everything in place.